All done. All silent. Going. Gone. So congratulations.
Welcome to the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate. Each episode, we chat with real estate author and industry leader Peter O'Malley to discuss the current property market conditions and provide insights to assist you on your property journey.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Current Market Insights. I'm your host, Kieran O'Brien, and as always with me this week is my good friend, Mr. Peter O'Malley. Peter, hello.
G'day, Kieran. Great to see you.
Great to see you, Peter, and as always, great to sit and chat about what has been in the week of real estate. I'd love to start this episode this week just getting a bit of a recap. What have we learnt this week? What have you seen out there talking to people on the hustings? What's your general sense of how the market is going locally for us?
Second big auction weekend of the year, Kieran. So everybody's trying to get a good read on where the market is at. If we go to the Sydney auction clearance rate, they came in at 59.1% on SQM Research's numbers. That's a pretty healthy result because SQM Research do factor in all the unreported results from the weekend and capture them by the following Tuesday. The results were so strong, in fact, the auction clearance rate was so strong, in fact, that Louis Christopher, who's the CEO of SQM Research and had one of the more pessimistic perspectives on the Sydney property market for 2024, was really surprised at how strong results were, to the degree that he said these were strong results for Sydney over the last week. The Saturday clearance rate was actually 60% on our numbers. We were recording clearance rates higher than this time last year and on stronger volumes. If this keeps up, our forecast for modest housing price falls in Sydney will be wrong, and the housing market may rise at a faster rate than 2023. What I would say we saw here in the Inner West, Kieran, we saw a lot of auction campaigns that were postponed due to insufficient buyer interest, you would imagine, and redated for February 24 or the 2nd of March. So I think it would be too early myself to jump to the conclusion that the Sydney property market is going to outperform for 2024, particularly given the auction clearance rate is slightly skewed by the amount of auctions that were postponed due to insufficient buyer interest.
So a couple of things to talk about out of that data, Peter. You mentioned the overall clearance rate around 59% or almost 60%. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, did we report last week that it was 54 or 55%? So it has actually increased in the week that we've seen?
Yes.
And that was also, I think we said, on numbers of 700 odd properties going to auction, which was an increase of maybe 300 or 400. So it's pretty clear we're seeing higher clearance rates and much higher volume than we have seen in the past 12 months.
Oh, that's right. Volumes are up, as we alluded to, and that's coming through in the data. There were 731 auctions scheduled. 83 were rescheduled. So Louis does capture the postponed auctions. So if you're looking to put a number on it, over 10% were postponed. Of those remaining, there was 215 that sold prior to auction and 217 that sold at auction under the hammer. So again, another consistent trend from last year, where it's a clean 50% selling prior to auction and 50% selling at auction of those that are considered auction sales.
Yeah, certainly strong numbers to start the year, and you can see why Louis has started to adjust his predictions. I wonder, the postpones that we are seeing, do you think that is a measure more of the fact that there is such a high volume on the market at the moment?
Definitely.
Or could it also be related to the fact that there are some potentially opportunistic sellers, running with the frenzy, or not the frenzy, but the heat of what's happening at the moment, and this observation that it is such a strong and active market? Are people jumping on when perhaps they're not priced right, or they're not ready for market and are just trying to ride the wave?
I think a lot of people looked at the headline price growth for 2023 of 11% for the year and said, hey, that looks pretty good. We're going to jump on board early in the new year there. The market has enjoyed some good growth that I'd like to get the best of it. What that misses, of course, Kieran, is that the auction clearance rate and the market at large really struggled after the November rate hike. What you've seen here in the first 6 weeks of 2024 is a lot of listings that have come to market at an unusually early time of year. And those auctions that were postponed, the agents, fair enough too, have made the assumption that they're better off holding off a little bit longer to let that sort of excess stock that's come to market work its way through the system, if you like. And if we don't see another surge of listings coming onto the market in the next 10 days, that's absolutely the right strategy. But if we get another wave or another surge of unusually high listing activity, that will then turn out to maybe be not such a smart call, because you would suspect the market will be under sustained pressure from there as buyers are faced with an excess of listing options.
Do you think it would be reasonable to assume that if the RBA next time they meet hold rates again, which may be a reasonable assumption at this point, do you think it would be reasonable then to assume that other potential sellers who are sitting on the sideline at the moment waiting may view that as a sign that they could move forward with their sale, knowing that the market is holding, potentially improving, and is not likely to go backwards, which would traditionally happen with a rate rise?
I think the RBA's movements with interest rates, or even if they hold, their decisions with interest rates are actually secondary now for households. What's more important is what is happening with individual households' budgets and finances. And by that, I mean that a lot of people have had their mortgage reset in the last 6 months, and it's easy to pay the first 2 or 3 mortgage repayments at the higher rate. But as those mortgage repayments get out to 6, 9, 12 months at the elevated rate, you may have been paying a mortgage rate of 2 or 2.5%, and suddenly you get dropped off and you're being asked by the bank to pay 6.25%. That's a really big change in your finances. And as I say, you can hang tough on waiting for the rate cuts, but if they're not forthcoming, the pressure builds on finances there, particularly at a time of cost of living. So I think what the RBA do as far as holding or increasing rates, the damage, or for some people, unfortunately, is already baked in, and the only thing that would rescue people who might have finances on a knife edge is rate cuts.
I'm glad you mentioned the term baked in. I read something this week, a comment relating to real estate agents and economists and how they're discussing the possibility of imminent or very short-term rate cuts, and how that's potentially...
That was Laura J's on Twitter, yeah?
Yeah, correct.
Having
and how
a
that's
shot at real estate agents.
Correct.
Predicting there'll be 2 rate cuts this year.
Correct. But interestingly, predicting that the language used by agents and perhaps some economists is deliberately geared to subtly entice buyers to bake in these rate cuts so that they can be a little bit more active in the market. Do you think that's a real problem? And do you think that, do you think agents are smart enough to think that far ahead and say, you know what, we should run the long game here and try and manipulate people?
I had a buyer's agent say to me last week that she's advising her buying clients to take advantage of this indecision in the market, because once they do cut rates later in the year, it's going to race again. And when you look at the post that Laura J's put on Twitter there, or X as it's now called, I guess, you got the sense that a real estate agent had said that directly to Laura J's, and she took issue with that, which is fair enough. There's no doubt that seasoned economists are calling for rate cuts at the moment. So there's no need for a real estate agent to go out and make a call and put that call on their shoulders in trying to entice a home buyer to purchase a property or bid on a property. The more intelligent and right way to do it is to show home buyers, this is if you're a real estate agent, is to show home buyers a range of forecasts as to what other economists or economists in the market think will happen with interest rates. But we are not economists here, and we have an interest in economics, but we've never said this is what the RBA will do or won't do, because A, we're not the RBA, and B, we're not economists. So I think all consumers need to be really wary out there when a real estate agent who is a realtor paid by the vendor to get the property sold for the best price they can tries to induce you into buying that property by telling you that finance will be cheaper later in the year.
Yeah, really good points. And I think it's important, and I'm glad you highlight that people do need to exercise a little bit of caution. And we've talked about this in so many other ways on the podcast. They need to do their own research. They need to make sure they've got a group of trusted advisors they can turn to get extra help as well.
Real estate agents are friendly. They are not your friends.
It's true. I do want to touch on, just very briefly before we move on, you did mention that Louis has talked about potentially adjusting his forecasts. Given that SQM in particular has been really quite accurate over the last few years with their forecasts, do you personally take that as a bit of a sign that the market may be performing better than Louis had predicted? Or do you think that he's just opening up the idea that he may need to rethink his position?
Look, we're not going to, on this podcast, dissect the market nuances this deep all year because A, it'll be incredibly boring, and B, there's no real need to do so. The reason last week and this week that we're really drilling down into what is exactly is happening in the market, because early in the new year, after a 4 to 6 week break of auctions, of meaningful listing activity on market, of transactions being done, everybody, including ourselves, is really keen to know where the market is at the moment. And unsurprisingly, there's conflicting signals. So Louis has not changed his forecast. He did qualify it by saying if this were to keep up, I would suspect that Sydney property will have a better year than I anticipated. But I would question whether, particularly with a postponement rate comfortably over 10%, which is what was recorded last weekend for auctions, I would really question whether the 60% clearance rate can sustain itself in the market. If it does, it does, and I'm happy to say, there you go, what a surprise. But speaking to buyers out in the field, they too are a little bit indecisive about where the market is heading this year and happy to sit on the sidelines in many cases and just watch where it's going. And the early trend that we picked up, which is increased listing activity this year and decreased sales volumes, is still the case now as we turn the corner for the middle of February.
Well, moving on slightly and talking of volumes, at the open homes I conducted over the weekend in the rental space, I noticed that there is still some activity, but it didn't feel quite as hot as the other weeks in the year. Have you any indications or any thoughts on whether this might be a bit of a turning of the tide in the rental market and potentially indicate a period of plateau or slowing down in the crisis that we've talked about? Or is this just, potentially an erroneous weekend in an otherwise crazy market?
Oh, it's the peak letting season coming to an end, Kieran. Yeah, that's what it is. Mid-February onwards, those that were looking to rehouse themselves for the new year have tended to do so. So with the rental market, if we've got a lease that's due to expire or does expire in December, for example, and the tenant wants to renew, we strongly encourage the landlord to offer a lease renewal that ends in the following January. We don't like leases ending in December because the landlord can end up with a vacant investment property over Christmas, which is the last time of year that you want an investment property empty, drawing cash from your savings account to pay the bills. But what's really important coming out of Christmas from there is that you have it released by the end of January, early February, because there is a flurry of leasing activity up until about mid-February, and then from mid-February to late March, it continues to cool. And from about April through to August can be a very challenging time to find a tenant because for whatever reason, the Sydney rental market does not perform anywhere near as strongly during winter as what it does at the beginning of the calendar year.
Yeah, very likely tied to things like school and university years, I might imagine, given that they're very, calendar-based in nature. If you are a tenant out there in the market looking, do you think it is a good time to try and find a property at the moment? As you say, that frenzy's kind of died off. Does that mean that there is also going to be less properties available on the market as we move into the next few months?
Vacancy rates are really, really low. And here at Harris Partners, our vacancy rate is essentially zero, which I've never actually seen our vacancy rate so low. Landlords, to help them fight the cost of living, inflation, higher mortgage costs, are looking for rental increases. They're not overstating it. We're making market-based rental increases based on what else is available and what is fair for the respective property. And I believe in 98% of cases, the tenants are agreeing to the offer of a rental increase rather than moving out. So that means that a lot of stock is not coming to market and existing tenants are staying where they are.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So would you say that in your time in real estate, would this be a period where tenants are tending to stay still longer than they have been in the past? And has that been the case since COVID? I mean, given the massive disruptions to everyone's lives over
would
the past
make
5
sense
years?
is that as the rental market has risen strongly coming out of COVID, and keeping in mind, at the start of COVID, the rental market dropped a clean 10%. I had lunch with a real estate agent from the eastern suburbs today who was reliving what happened at the beginning of COVID. And he had in one day, he had 80 tenants walk sets of keys back in, 80 different tenants in one day, and just hand the keys back over the counter and saying, I'm leaving Australia, have your rental property back. So the rental market across the board dropped 10%, but in some of those inner city areas, it dropped out to 20-25%. So the rebound in prices was not actually the rental market experiencing a rental crisis. It was just the market reverting to the mean. We have gone past that point now, as we all know, and we are in a fully fledged rental crisis now that shows no signs of abating. There might be periods of consolidation, as there always is in any breakout. That'll probably come mid-year. But it makes sense that tenants are staying locked and loaded in leases, and it's much cheaper and advisable to pay the rental increase than hire a removal truck and move down the road and get hit with the same rental increase a few months later anyway.
Yeah, tough time for everyone in the rental market, but certainly some good advice. I want to transition if we can, Peter. I watched a video the other day, I think it was on your Twitter feed actually, the 9 News report talking about a young couple who had purchased off the plan in a development just southwest of Sydney. And they were...
This was Wilton Green,
At
yeah?
Wilton Green, yep. And basically from the news piece, the discussion was these guys had paid a pretty sizable chunk of money up front for a house and land package, and some time later, a couple of years, almost 3 years now, the land was still not registered, and they're now being told that the company's collapsing, and in fact the land may not be registered anytime in the next 3 to 4 years. What can you tell me about this particular story, and is this unique, or is this something that you've seen before?
I think in reposting that particular story out, the first thing that grabbed me is that was Country Garden, the second Chinese behemoth developer that's under financial pressure. And as we know, Evergrande has already imploded. And Evergrande imploded on Monday, January 29. And because we're recording this on Valentine's Day, February 14, people can think that, yes, a massive Chinese developer with $320 billion in debts has imploded, both with Chinese domestic bondholders and international bondholders. It's imploded, but that's just an event that happened a few weeks ago, and it's business as normal. Things like that take time to ripple through the system, and watching that poor couple sort of outline their story as to what's happened in Western Sydney with Evergrande's main competitor, Country Garden, just highlighted to me very quickly that the risks that are coming out of China are not over. You can't have a behemoth to the tune of $320 billion, implode and there not be a ripple effect or ramifications from that. So I think that's the first takeout. If you're a home buyer and you're looking at that and saying, what are the lessons here? I don't want to be critical of anyone that's purchased into Wilton Garden or any off-the-plan arrangement, but the reality is it was high on vision, and it was dependent on the story, the economic story, staying good. And clearly the economic story for Country Garden and Evergrande and the Chinese market at large is not good now, like it was 2 years ago when they put their deposit down. So when there's a large gap between your signing of a contract and the delivery of that service, even if you're buying a car, let's cut across to cars, you can sign a contract to buy a car coming next year, but it's still got to get here. And that's, I think, the other takeout of that is it was high on vision but low on substance, unfortunately.
I must say that the most interesting take for me from the piece, other than what really is a tragic story for this young couple, was the fact that Country Garden, or Risland as the company they were operating under in Australia, owned 90% of that development in Wilton Greens. And to me, as someone who knows the area relatively well and has actually looked at that estate, driving past before, I would never have once considered that, in fact, that was a Chinese state-owned and managed development. I just assumed it was, Australian developers building Australian land holdings. And I just find it really interesting that we are, in some way, so beholden to the financial success of a company thousands of kilometres away who really has no real footprint here in Australia other than these developments that, they're taking money up front to try and get off the ground in the long term.
Well, I could tell you one thing, Multiplex, Lendlease, Meriton, they don't have any housing developments in China you can put a deposit down.
Yeah, it's true. Absolutely. The other thing I wanted to sort of talk about with this piece, hold that. No, really, really interesting, Peter. I think I'd love to do an episode at sometime in the future where we actually step through some of the process involved in house and land, because I think it might be quite informative for someone to learn, what is involved and what is land registration and utilities development and all the things that they may not consider when they sign on to what sounds like a great deal in the Southwest Corridor for, say, $700,000. Sounds too good at the time and may be that case.
Look, and I wouldn't even be critical to say that these people were hoodwinked and, signed up for something that was too good to be true. What a salesperson will always do in most instances is tell you what their best case scenario is. And that's probably all the salesperson did in signing these people to the contract. But when you get a contract, you must remember that there's no such thing as a standard contract. And the most powerful time in any negotiation is before you sign the contract, because the power in a negotiation rests with the person that's prepared to walk away. And I helped someone else negotiate an agency agreement for the sale of their investment property down the South Coast. And he said, I'm really sorry to lean on you, but this is your forte, not mine. Could you give me some guidance here? And it's like, no need to apologise. The time to ask for help from a professional when signing contracts is before you sign it. Because for every one person that's ever asked me or you for guidance on signing a real estate contract before they've signed it, we've had 10 people that have signed a contract and regretted it and brought it in and said, do you reckon you could get me out of this, or what are my rights now? What are my options? So keep that in mind, whether it's buying a house and land, buying an off-the-plan apartment, or listing your property on the market. The most powerful time in that negotiation is before you sign the paperwork.
Yeah, exactly. As we move towards the close tonight, Peter, I just wanted to get a sense of the week ahead. We've got CPI numbers coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and then early next month, obviously, the RBA will meet again. What are your thoughts on what we might see in real estate this week, and do you think there'll be any shifts in what we have seen?
Oh, look, broadly speaking, the US had a bad inflation number overnight. Markets didn't like that. They were looking for inflation to continue trending down, and it actually increased. Hopefully that's isolated to the US economy. Hopefully that's isolated to one reading. But it's not a great indicator, and it does have markets a little bit jittery. We won't get our next CPI inflation number until the 28th of February. So we won't quite get that in the next week, but that'll be a big number when it drops to see how we're tracking in that regard. The RBA are not meeting on the first Tuesday of every month anymore, as we know. So the next 3 RBA meetings, because keeping in mind, the people are looking for a rate cut from here. So the next 3 times the RBA have an opportunity to cut interest rates or announce an interest rate cut is March 19, May 7 and June 18. So that's mapping out what's in front of us for the RBA. I don't think you'll see a rate cut personally in any of those meetings, but if numbers are derailed from June 18 onwards, that's when the retail banks have suggested you could start possibly thinking about a rate cut at that point in time. So answering your question, coming back to the short term in the week ahead, I think we should all be looking at stock levels and how many auctions are postponed versus being pushed to auction on the day. If there's another 10 to 15% of auctions being rescheduled because there's not enough buyer interest this weekend, all that means is the inevitability that pressures that are building up on the market is being pushed from February to March. That's the big play at the moment for mine.
Yeah, really good insights, Peter. And as always, a really great episode. I always value our chats, and I feel like I learn something every week, and I hope that our listeners do as well. So thank you, Pete, for chatting with us today.
Pleasure, Kieran.
Given it is the 14th today, a happy Valentine's Day to everyone out there. Thanks for listening to Current Market Insights, and we look forward to chatting with you next week.
Thanks for joining us on the Current Market Insights podcast, brought to you by Harris Partners Real Estate, the podcast providing real estate insights you won't find anywhere else.